would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the land of acknowledging the indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. Now, while we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we call home. Now, I want to unfortunately share some very sad news today. Longtime Seattle 4 Rotarian Janice Weinmiller has passed away. Janice was an engaged club member in a number of committees and was a Paul Harris Fellow since January of 2019. So I'd like to take a moment of silence in memory of Janice. All right, thank you. Now I would like to call on our music committee member, Jimmy Collins, to open our meeting today. Jimmy.
Thanks very much, President Beth. On behalf of the music committee, we are pleased to share a audio tribute to our fellow member and speaker, Dorothy Bullitt. I'd like to just acknowledge the team that put this together, our lyricist and vocalist, Linda Ruff, our accompanist, Freeman Fong, and our cameraman, Rick Russell. So with that, Mary. Dorothy, this one's for you because you are unforgettable. Unforgettable, that's what you are. Unforgettable, you raise the bar. Like the legacies that cling to you, you deserve them, so we sing to you. You give so much, all that you touch. Irreplaceable, you're one of a kind, and unshakable, what a great mind. That's why, Dorothy, it's incredible that someone so unforgettable helps make our club unforgettable too. That's why, Dorothy, it's incredible that someone so unforgettable helps make our club unforgettable too.
Dorothy? That was amazing. Thank you to the music committee. I so appreciate that. And now I would like to invite club member Rabbi Wiener to share our inspiration for the day.
Thank you. Source of light, of good, and of blessing. As we celebrate this month honoring women, more than half of humanity's population, let us blend our tribute and celebration with time for reflection, reevaluation, and ultimately repentance. For we have met the sanctity of the blessings of childbirth, with cultural constraints that limit women's opportunity and potential. We have lauded the physical strength of men, while giving faint praise for the empathy, patience, and care of women. We deify the determination, independence, and moxie of maverick males, while denigrating those same critical qualities as harsh, nasty, and patently unfeminine. And while much has changed in the last century, As patriarchy gives way to equality, rigid stereotypes to open-minded acceptance, there is much left to do, to repair, and to redress. Today, we celebrate generations of a pioneering Seattle family whose women profoundly and enduringly transform the character and very nature of our community. We are grateful for them and for all women who transcended archaic attitudes, senseless slights, and unjust denials of the chance to live out their ultimate purpose as fully realized beings created in your image. May our professed joy on this day grow into true justice for women everywhere, and may the regrets of our past lay the cornerstones of true equality in the future. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi. And thank you also again to the Music Committee, all that you have done to set the stage for today's meeting today. Really appreciate that. I'd like to also thank Pete Delane for serving as our meeting reporter. Now, Karma McKay, will you please introduce our guests who have joined us online today?
I'd be happy to. Thanks, Beth. And if I don't say your name, please put your name in the chat box just so we can see who else is here. The list I'm going to read, I'm assuming the people are here or they're on their way. And that would be J.D. Crones from Central Colorado, the Granbury Rotary Club. Jack Shalom, I think you are here. Fatima Kakwani, Rena McCobre, Peggy Flynn, who is a member of the Anacortes Rotary Club, and Leonora Senso, Jill Bullitt, past District Governor John Anger from the West Seattle Rotary Club, and past District Governor J.J. Gardner. So thank you all for coming. And many of those people that I mentioned are friends of Dorothy.
Excellent. Thanks, Karma. All right, now I'd like to invite club member David Frum to introduce our short program for today. David.
Good afternoon. Lisa Richmond is a friend, and I could say, and I hope she agrees with me, it's a mutual admiration society between us. Lisa is a climate strategist and a senior fellow with Architecture 2030, a think tank focused on transforming the built environment to zero carbon. She served as a delegate to 2 UN climate summits, COP26 and COP27, as executive director, where I got to know her as of the American Institute of Architects of Seattle, where she was for 15 years. Lisa helped lead the association's national agenda on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, promoting climate action and education in AIA chapters across the US. She's a Harvard Loeb Fellow and a trained leader with Al Gore's Climate Reality Project. Lisa?
Thank you so much, David. And Mary, I think you're going to share my slides. Yeah, thank you. So David is absolutely right. It is a mutual admiration society. David's work in designing facilities for healthcare has really made a national impact and has been inspiring to me personally. So I was really humbled when he asked me to join you guys today. And I'm going to take just a few minutes to share my experience at the recent UN Climate Summit and some of my takeaways there. But I will just share my biggest takeaway right up front. And that's that climate change obviously is a global phenomenon, and it's helpful to understand the global context of things like these climate negotiations to give us a roadmap. But the solutions are local, and change happens right here with us. So it gives us a tremendous amount of agency. I'd like to just start by sharing why I care. So this is my beautiful daughter, Winsome. She's actually a young woman now, and as her mom, I want her to have a wonderful future, which includes inheriting a healthy planet. And I realized a few years ago that I couldn't rely on other people to fix the climate problem. I really needed to step up and be a part of that. So really, I guess even despite my discomfort a little bit, I pivoted my profession to use my platform in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry to address climate, first through my role as executive director of the American Institute of Architects in Seattle, and now as a senior fellow with Architecture 2030, a think tank. Next slide, Mary. So COP is Conference of the Parties. COP27 was the UN Climate Summit hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt in November, and I was able to attend as a delegate, convener, and speaker. COP, Conference of the Parties, stands for the countries that signed the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, as well as the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, both of which try to limit dangerous human interference with our climate system and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Next slide. Since those agreements were signed, UNFCCC has come out with many reports, the most recent one just this past Monday about the dangers posed to us by climate change and our need to act really now within this decade to avoid the worst impacts of it. So we know what we need to do, and that's why every year the parties to these conventions convene the COP summits to monitor the progress of the signatories, hopefully to elevate their own ambition, and also increasingly to coordinate implementation. Next slide. Heads of state and negotiators obviously attend these summits, but so do thousands of delegates like me who represent organizations that are recognized as official observers by the UN. And we attend obviously to influence the negotiators and to pressure our elected leaders to do the right thing, but also to work together to implement strategies to achieve the Paris goals. And Architecture 2030 actually is not alone in representing the built environment from the US at COP. There are about a half a dozen organizations working on the built environment that attend. Next slide. Because, as it turns out, the built environment, buildings and infrastructure are really, really important to addressing climate change. Buildings contribute anywhere from 35 to 50% of carbon emissions globally, depending on how you measure it. Next slide. Those come from a couple of sources. One is building operations. So carbon that's emitted when we burn fuels to heat and cool our buildings, cook and power our devices. We call that operating carbon, and it's emitted over the lifetime of the building. But the other significant source is the carbon that's emitted when building materials are extracted and manufactured and during the construction process. We call that embodied carbon, and it's emitted almost all upfront at the beginning of a building's life cycle. So it's particularly important to address right now when we have a very tight window to make significant change. Next slide. So the question is, if buildings are so important, how are we doing? And every year in the fall at COP, the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction releases a status report. And the good news is we are making progress, particularly on operating carbon. We're designing buildings better. We know what to do, and we have most of the technologies that we need. So we're able to reduce the carbon footprint of buildings by making some good decisions up front. But the bad news is that growth is outpacing progress. We are simply building faster than we can make improvements. And that is going to continue for the foreseeable future. Over the next 40 years, it's anticipated we will add the equivalent of a city of Paris to this planet every single week. A lot of that is driven by the population increase in the global south. And that means you can go quickly through the next few, Mary. That means hundreds of millions of new homes, healthcare facilities, schools and universities, roads, parks, and bridges. It's a lot of building. And so if we're going to be constructing that much, we've got to do a better job than we have been doing. So what does better look like? Here are the ideas that I walked away from COP with. The first is that we've got to accelerate the progress we've already been making on operating carbon. Next slide. That looks like investing in a clean grid, electrifying all of our buildings, and using efficient systems and appliances. And in fact, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, invests billions of dollars into just that transformation. In developing economies, we actually have the opportunity to leapfrog dirty power sources with systems like distributed and wind and solar, as well as no-cost strategies like passive cooling. Next slide. Second, we have got to get the carbon emissions out of our materials. Next. Two materials used primarily in construction, concrete and steel, emit more than 20% of global CO2 emissions. Two materials emit 20%. And if we're going to continue to use them, we have to make them cleaner. And in fact, that is the focus of a UN initiative that was launched at COP26 in Glasgow called the Breakthrough Agenda, which is using market mechanisms to improve technologies and manufacturing systems for concrete and steel with some initial success. But even better is replacing as much concrete and steel as possible with low carbon biomaterials like the mud brick used in the school in Rwanda that by Mass Design Group that was on the previous slide. And one of the co-benefits of that strategy is that it creates new jobs and livelihoods in local materials manufacture. We have our own homegrown version of that with cross-laminated timber, CLT, which we are using here in Washington State to build tall buildings that sequester carbon and create timber industry jobs. Third, we've just got to consume less. And that means smaller buildings, and it also means using what we have. The greenest building is the one that's already built. Before starting any kind of development, we need to step back and ask, what are the alternatives? Retrofitting is almost always going to be the more carbon efficient option. And finally, all of us need to step up as professionals, business owners, community leaders, and of course, voters. I have really come to believe that every job is a climate job, and we are all climate workers in addition to whatever else we do, because how we run our businesses, invest our money, build and operate our homes and buildings, all of these are implementation decisions that we have control over. And I'm really excited to be talking to Rotary today, because Rotary is a great place to build connections and momentum towards a healthier planet. So I just want to thank you for including climate among the many issues where you're trying to make an impact and connect for good. And I know we don't have Q&A time, but I'm happy for Mary to share my email address if anyone wants to follow up. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate that. And we can use the chat if people have questions that they want to put in the chat, and Lisa can try to answer them there, or you can reach out via email. So I am so honored to introduce our featured speaker today, Dorothy Bullitt. There is so much to tell about Dorothy's background, but I'm going to share just a few highlights. So she received her Bachelor of Arts as well as her MBA from the University of Washington, and she has a law degree from Boston University. She's a distinguished practitioner and senior lecturer from the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Affairs. Her previous roles include CEO of Habitat for Humanity of Seattle, South King County, Chief Operating Officer of Harbor Properties, and serving as Assistant State Attorney General. Now, she's long been involved in community service, chairing Washington's Rhodes Scholars Selection Committee, the Unity Project, the Washington State Public Lands Advisory Committee. She served on the Seattle Human Rights Commission and numerous civic and academic boards. Now, most notably related to all of us, Dorothy served as the second woman president of Seattle 4 Rotary in 1987 and has the very distinguished honor of securing Archbishop Desmond Tutu as a speaker during her year as president. And Seattle 4 was the only Rotary International venue where he spoke while in the United States. Now, in spite of her impressive career, Dorothy lives with incredible grace and humility, and she's extraordinarily generous to our community. Please welcome our grand finale for Women's History Month, Dorothy Bullitt.
Thank you so much, Beth. Well, my topic is a history of women in leadership through the prism of one Seattle family. How have women leaders changed in the 130 rough years since Washington became a state? What characteristics have endured? I'd like to explore those questions by offering a snapshot of 4 generations of Seattle women, each called to leadership within a different social context, each by coincidence my kin. My great-grandmother, Harriet Overton Stimson, a piano teacher from the cultured East, arrived in Seattle in 1889 when it was still a frontier town. Her husband, C.D., was a successful real estate developer and timberman. At a time when the lack of labor-saving devices made every household dependent on the full-time services of at least one person, C.D.'s wealth allowed Harriet to hire people to maintain their household. That, along with her husband's moral support, freed Harriet to assume a leadership role in this young city. At the end of the 19th century, with their men focused on building the city's physical infrastructure and economy, certain society matrons, among them Harriet, concentrated on civilizing the place. They spearheaded the creation of Children's Hospital, Cornish School, the Seattle Symphony, and the Arboretum. The symphony's first conductor was Harriet's music teacher, imported from Michigan. The organizers borrowed their husbands' evening clothes for the musicians to wear on the night of their debut. My great-grandmother was reportedly a diligent, frugal, sensible woman with a strong sense of civic duty, traits she passed on to her daughter, my grandmother, Dorothy Stimson Bullitt, or DSB. Following an apparently happy childhood and marriage to a charismatic politician, DSB lost the 3 principal men in her life at the beginning of the Great Depression. Her father when she was 37, her brother when she was 39, and her husband in 1932, soon after she turned 40. When her husband died, she faced the responsibility of completing the upbringing of my father and his 2 sisters, with no man to help her. She had gone to finishing school, but not college. She could neither type nor cook, and she had never held a paying job. With neither experience nor formal training, she took over the family's property management business. This involved running a largely empty office building and several smaller properties at the time when business was poor and tenants were struggling through the Depression, were desperate. DSB was handicapped not only by ignorance, but by the challenge of dealing with other business executives, all of them men. Some refused to deal with her because they felt inhibited from shouting or pounding on the table, and others she would not deal with because they insisted on shouting and pounding on the table. On the other hand, some went out of their way to help her, in part because as a woman, they did not regard her as a competitor. My grandmother discovered that she had a natural genius for business and managed to inspire others to follow her lead. Against the odds, she succeeded in the real estate business. Then in the 1940s, she cashed in most of her property and gambled on a new, largely untested venture, television. She'd been intrigued by the new technology since encountering it at the 1926 World's Fair. In her late 50s, DSB bought a money-losing radio station and a fledgling television station at a time when virtually no one in the Seattle area owned a TV set. Her lawyer considered hiring a guardian to protect her from her own bad judgment. A cousin considered committing her to a mental institution for her folly. DSB built the stations into King Broadcasting Company a business that came to serve millions of customers in several states. Over the course of her career, DSB also became a civic leader. She served as the first woman on the University of Washington's Board of Regents, on the Seattle Library Board, on the board of a major bank, and on the committee that established the Grand Coulee Dam. During World War II, she joined the Civic Unity Committee, which was established to help Seattle absorb a diverse population of newcomers here to assist with the war effort. After the war ended, the Civic Unity Committee focused on housing and educational opportunities for racial minorities. When the committee dissolved in 1964, its role was supplanted by Seattle's active civil rights movement, led by the Urban League and NAACP. In 1960, DSB became the first woman ever honored as Seattle's first citizen. In 2000, her sons Stim, daughters Patsy and Harriet, daughter-in-law Kay, and I were similarly honored. Like DSB and Harriet Overton Stimson, my mother, Kay Bullitt, believed that service is the rent each of us pays for living. Kay dedicated her life to civic activism and private acts of kindness. Like CD, who supported Harriet's activism, my father, Stim, supported Kay's volunteer work, allowing her promise to be realized throughout their marriage and long after their divorce. Through her leadership of numerous organizations, Kay promoted racial justice as one of the few white members of the Urban League Board in the 1960s. She championed open housing and employment opportunity. She also put on an interracial day camp in her backyard, our backyard, to get during the height of the civil rights and Black Power movement to get kids enjoying one another in a safe place and helping to build harmony. Public education, she founded private initiatives in public education, which became part of the Alliance for Education. Peace Trees Vietnam began in her kitchen, the Goodwill Games in her living room, and the Middle East Peace Camp in her backyard. A woman's right to borrow money without a husband's permission. Sound Savings and Loan began in her living room. Historic preservation, she helped found and lead Northwest Seaport. The arts, she was a founder and the first president of Bumbershoot, which she named. And with her in-laws, she fought for the environmental protection of the Pacific Northwest as a longtime member of the Bullitt Foundation board. Unlike her mother-in-law, Kay's leadership grew out of her grassroots activism. She was driven by a passion to solve social problems. Like DSB, Kay was an entrepreneur, but most of the organizations she helped establish were not-for-profit. Some thrived, some failed. Kay took risks because she cared deeply about the causes she championed. Like DSB, she cared deeply about the people she worked with and for. Their leadership styles were different. DSB's was more top-down, Kay's more bottom-up. DSB led from the top of a pyramid. Kay flipped the pyramid and led with a team of equals. Both women were intelligent and creative, but one seemed to lead from her brain and gut, the other from her heart. They loved and admired one another and never competed. DSB once observed that my mother's character resembled that of her mother, Harriet Overton Stimson. DSB, who'd succeeded in business and civic affairs in an environment comprised entirely of men, tried to convince her two daughters to subordinate aspects of their femininity in order to blend in. One piece of advice that stood out for my aunts: never excuse yourself during a business meeting to go to the restroom. Like her mother, Harriet Stimson, DSB was always on time, and she impressed on her daughters the importance of punctuality. My mom never got that memo. It was a sign of respect for one's colleagues, DSB explained, but also protection against criticism for men eager to look for a reason to dismiss a female leader. DSB's daughter, Harriet, named for her grandmother, wanted to be an engineer, but she was driven out of the department by her UW professors, who insisted that her good looks were distracting the male students while she took up a spot that should belong to a man. So she left the UW and went off to study home economics in Vermont. After marrying a research doctor, Harriet plunged into scientific research at his side. That led her to discover the marvels of the natural world, particularly snakes, particularly rattlesnakes. After her marriage ended, she launched Pacific Search, the Northwest's first environmental scientific magazine for the general public. In time, Harriet's passion drove her to convince the Bullitt Foundation to focus its resources on environmental protection. Her leadership style was a unique blend of blunt, creative, and scientific, different from the styles of my mother, and her mother's mother, but effective nonetheless. Harriet would become the visionary founder and leader of Sleeping Lady, the Northwest's first environmentally focused resort. Many in Eastern Washington, where it was based, thought she was nuts to establish such a thing and predicted it would fail. But it thrived both financially and culturally and enriched the surrounding region. Before her death last April, Harriet left the resort to her longtime employees. Despite her iconoclastic, no-nonsense style, she, like her mother and mine, always looked after her people. Dorothy's other daughter, my Aunt Patsy Collins, served as chairman of the boards of King Broadcasting Company and the Bullitt Foundation, and was the visionary behind Seattle's Garden of Remembrance. Patsy was intelligent, diligent, and like her grandmother, deeply committed to her civic duty. She was also a superb public speaker. In the mid-1980s, Aunt Patsy once brought a visiting Palestinian leader to speak to the all-male Rotary Club of Seattle. A Seattle Rotarian, by coincidence Patsy's neighbor, collected the speaker at the ballroom door. He instructed Patsy, chairman of King Broadcasting Company at the time, to wait for her guest outside in the hall for the next 1.5 hours. She did so without complaint, since that remained the way of the world in the 1980s. Less than a decade later, when I joined that same Rotary Club, it had integrated, but was still roughly 95% male. Many members seemed very conscious of and not entirely happy about the club's recent gender integration. But when I became our club's president a decade after that, the atmosphere had changed a lot. Throughout my 50 weeks at the podium, and as I presided over the club's board and committees, I felt comfortable, welcomed, and accepted, and never at the expense of my innate personality or femininity. Times had changed sufficiently during the 20 years since I left law school to allow women to lead in ways that flow naturally from who we are. No more squatty shoes and managed ties from the days I spent in the courtroom trying cases in the early 1980s. No more macho leadership tactics, into which many women executives drifted during the years I spent as a corporate leader in the late 1980s and early 90s. Something changed when a critical mass of women entered positions of leadership in the professions, business, and not-for-profit organizations. Now both women and men seem better able to express their own peculiar styles of leadership derived from their inherent strengths and personalities, styles of leadership less prescribed for either gender than was true for any previous generation. Yet there are certain traits that have won respect for women and men in leadership roles throughout the last century, traits that transcend otherwise huge cultural shifts. It has been my professional experience and my sense, looking back at the generations who came before, that the leaders considered most valuable and successful are not necessarily the most brilliant. Mary, you can get rid of that slide. Rather, they are confident, hardworking people who play fair, turn up on time, produce the work they've promised when they've promised, regardless, and treat the people they work with, regardless of position, with respect. To do this requires adequate authority and resources to fulfill the responsibilities they've undertaken. Another important aspect of effective leadership that transcends gender or generation is authenticity. What do I mean by authenticity? Look around. Who seems comfortable in their own skin? Once we figure out who we are, identify and build on our particular strengths, and recognize and compensate for our weaknesses, we can lead more easily. So, oh, by the way, something that wasn't mentioned in my introduction is that my specialty was leadership at the University of Washington. That's part of why I was asked to give this speech. So could the women of my family who found ways to lead under more complicated circumstances than many women face today. Leaders can function in different ways and still be effective. Some leaders are highly analytical, like my Aunt Harriet. Others are dutiful and task-oriented, like my Aunt Patsy and Harriet Overton Stimson. Others focus on relationships and harmony, as did my mother, Kay. Still others are creative visionaries, like my grandmother, DSB. I'm a blend of dutiful, like my great-grandmother, and relationship-oriented, like my mom. Any of these styles can result in effective leadership. The key is to determine what makes you effective, what stresses you, what gives you energy. When you figure this out, communicate with those around you, your style, your strengths, what can you contribute, your weaknesses, how might these be mitigated? How might people whose styles and strengths complement yours be enlisted so that together you can achieve success? In the process, you will seem more authentic. You will be more authentic. Think about public figures. Who among them seem authentic? Whether or not you admire them, you can probably recognize their leadership. You may detest them, but still see what allows them to lead. What about your colleagues, fellow Rotarians, relatives? Do some seem particularly authentic? Can you sense their personal power? Without authenticity, leaders will falter. When we sense that someone is disinclined or someone is uncomfortable in their own skin, we feel uneasy and disinclined to follow them. This was true when my great-grandmother was helping to establish the Seattle Symphony and Children's Hospital, and when my grandmother was building King Broadcasting Company and serving as a UW regent. It was true when my aunts sought to mobilize the region to protect and improve our physical cultural environment, and when my mom enlisted her fellow citizens to push our region in a more equitable, just, and peaceful direction. It remained true for me in each of my 6 careers and as an active citizen. I believe it remains true here at Rotary, where women have broken every glass ceiling, including that of president of Rotary International. Women on Rotary leadership teams have become routine. With so many women in leadership, we now see a full array of personality and style. And these characteristics now stand out more than gender, has long been true of our male leaders. Whether in management, the professions, civic affairs, or private life, now or 130 years ago, we are better able to lead and more likely to motivate others if we are fully authorized and resourced to achieve our collective goals, if we play fair, competently, and courteously do what we promise when we promise. But without authenticity, we will fall short. Thank you for inviting me to speak to my club. If time permits, I will welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dorothy. Awesome. I'm glad that we could organize today, and a big shout out to Bill Center for suggesting you. I can see why he did that now. So this has been very informative, and I thought I knew you, but apparently I knew nothing in comparison to what you just shared with us. I'm going to start with 2 quick questions because there's a lot of questions, and we've got about 12 minutes, which is pretty good. Do you have daughters?
I do not have daughters. I have nieces and I have nephews. and former students.
Does that,
Mhm.
how do I ask this politely and gently?
No, that's okay.
Does it bum you that you're then the last of this generation of women? Or is that not a
Oh.
true statement?
Well, I mean, I have very capable relatives. I think one of my sisters is on Zoom, and she's a very talented painter and has taught and has raised an amazing daughter who's off getting her PhD at Stanford after having gotten her law degree at Harvard with great promise. And I have a niece who's a restaurateur and leading a lot of people and quite innovative down in Pasadena. So, and a lot of talent, but in it's just different.
Yeah.
That heavy civic role that I describe here, that is less common in the generation that's coming, but that may be just the state of the world and the nature of the country.
Did it feel like there was a lot of pressure on you and your relatives to continue this banner, or did you sometimes just want to be a beach bum?
Oh, I think that I'm just naturally had a very strong civic orientation and very dutiful person. And I had aptitude in areas that were relevant. Yeah. Many of the people in my generation are artists and very talented, but it's just a different arena.
Yeah. Okay.
My parents were both very active in civic life. And I mean, they'd take me into the voting booth, and they had all sorts of gatherings that were civic or political in nature. And so I just was always around it and watched. I mean, I had all these relatives who were working way into old age. That I don't know if I will be as busy as they were.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So now to some real questions. Your family has such a long list of groundbreaking legacies of all of the things the women in your family have accomplished. Which one inspired you the most?
Oh, I think my mom. Just her decency to everyone. I mean, she just lived her values. For example, she was so involved in civil rights, and she did it on a very granular level. She took my brother and me with her, with a man who when open housing occurred in Seattle, legally, there was still tremendous discrimination against African Americans. So we wandered around the neighborhood, just knocking on apartment doors, and she would just cause the landlord to have to, if they were going to turn the guy down, they had to do it in front of these children. I just see a note from Jeff Shalom. He and I went to elementary school together, and I enjoyed his presentation last week a lot.
You've got a lot of fans in the chat. So when we're done, hopefully you've got a minute to read through some of your fandom and your fan mail. Please tell us about the impact, the master's degree program, which you curated in the UW Evans School. How did you prepare graduates to lead effectively?
Is that from Bill Center?
It is not.
Oh, it's not? Okay. Well, I drew from leadership experience in my varied careers. I drew from people who I admired, all different kinds of leaders in the community. Many of them are Rotarians who I brought in to talk with students and work with them. I tried to help the students prepare to work in the real world and to get to know themselves, which relates to my comments earlier about authenticity, of really figuring out what motivates them, what gives them energy, and how to effectively manage a diverse work environment. And so, but it was partly just very academic, Harvard cases and a typical leadership curriculum, but I think it had a personal touch as well.
So many times this year with Beth, I've woken up and just be glad it's a Wednesday, and then there's people like you in this world. I don't know what I'm even doing here. You've
Oh,
spoken to the history of your family. I'd love to hear about your personal commitment to community beyond Rotary, emphasizing your attendance at Garfield High School during a very troubled time.
well, that my time in Garfield, which was during the Black Power movement, the Panthers came and they started the breakfast program. That was happening all around the country, but that was a very positive thing. There was a lot of violence in my school. There was a lot of rage in my school, and I certainly learned a lot. It was a very weak time academically, but being in a very diverse environment caused me to have a real passion for human rights and racial justice. And that led me in my 20s to write a letter to the Human Rights Commission. I saw an ad in the paper. I saw they were looking for members. So I was 25 years old and I just said, I'd really like to be a part of it, and was able to get on. And so that's just an example of how, I guess, the values that I have were informed in childhood and have played out, just built one upon another.
Yeah. Your family has such a rich history of progressive thinking and leadership. Sadly, that word is perceived by many today as negative. I'm curious why you think that progressive seed has been passed down through generations. How has that even been passed down?
Well, I mean, I think that if in my case, I had aunts and a grandmother, two grandmothers, and my parents who lived their values, and their values were in part about racial justice, about peace. My father, when he was president of King Broadcasting Company, he came out against the war in Vietnam in 1966, the first broadcaster to do that, the first editorial, very stiff, but quite a dramatic thing to do. And there was a cost to it. People came and screamed at him and banged on our door and made insulting calls. My mom worked with Ed Pratt, who was assassinated on his porch. And I remember when the person came to our door to say that her friend and colleague on the Urban Lake had been assassinated, and she crumpled by the door. So it wasn't abstract, these values. They were in the form of a day camp. They were in the form of my parents volunteering at Meany and Garfield and other places. So I think that just like John Bridge probably feels about the role of his parents in instilling the progressive values that he has through their own example, it was not just academic at all.
Yeah. What do you hope will be the next major milestone towards gender equality?
Well, I mean, I could get political here, but we have to, I mean, I think have to preserve the rights of women to control their reproductive freedom, because if that changes, then there won't be progress. It will be the reverse.
I think that's okay. That's not overly
Yeah.
political.
Mhm.
Any favorite stories from did you want to add to that?
No.
Okay. I think this connects to the thing that you just mentioned a minute or two ago. Any favorite stories from your amazing civic gatherings that took place in your backyard? Any that you feel deeply impacted yourself as a leader?
Well, there certainly were lots of gatherings. And there was the mother started this Middle East peace camp. I was an adult, but I lived near her and I saw her regularly. And she brought together Jewish kids and kids of Arab backgrounds to play, to do things that can happen in a day camp, but also to concentrate on peace here and peace in the Middle East. So that would be an example. The racial, the interracial day camp that she put on in the yard had a huge impact on many of us in terms of of race relations, but also because she believed in young people working. And so she hired kids as young as 12 to be the counselors. And so that she believed that a small amount of compensation and work was very important to help instill a work ethic in young people. So that, I mean, there are just so many examples.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna end this conversation today with another question that pertains to all of this.
Okay.
Last question then. Can you comment on the impact of the Bullitt Foundation?
Oh, well, I think it has been important, particularly for nurturing environmental organizations in the Pacific Northwest and trying to get them strong. So when the foundation sunsets, that they can persevere. The decision was made to go in a big way to try to counter climate change, investing much of the money that was bestowed to the foundation in the shorter term. So it will sunset soon.
Okay.
And it was because so much was at stake. And then the building, the Bullitt Center that was created has been a model for commercial buildings all around the world to produce no carbon emissions and to, in fact, generate power in a ecologically valuable way.
Nice tie-in to our short program. And
I
Lisa
thought the same
Richardson.
thing.
Well done. All
Yeah.
right, last question. When do you start working on the documentary and the book?
Oh,
This conversation today is so.
Oh, I think all my relatives have to die before that can happen.
Oh wow, that's not dramatic.
Would you like to write a story about your family?
Have you met my family? I think my family, God bless them, but they might pale in comparison to yours just a little bit.
Oh, there's more to my family. Yeah, we're interesting bunch.
It would be, I mean, it's been such an interesting conversation today for all of us to sort of hear and learn, be inspired. Don't forget to look at all your fan mail. I mean, really inspiring, like from you and back and forward. And I really appreciate you being here today and sharing all this. I'm very pleased to have been part of this month's Women's History Month.
Thank you very much.
To you, to Lisa, to Bill for suggesting you. And yeah, let's always celebrate Women's History Month every day of the year. So President Beth, back to you.
I like that idea, Ken. Dorothy, thank you so much. We're just so grateful for you sharing that, your amazing story. Now, I know you already know this probably, but Seattle 4 is contributing another 600 servings of healthy produce in your name as our speaker to Harvest Against Hunger. And we're also going to offer you a complimentary pass for you to invite a guest to a future meeting of Seattle 4.
Oh, what a favor.
I'd also like to thank our sponsors, our longtime gold sponsor, Bob Alexander. We're grateful for his support. And one last reminder that next week is one of those infrequent 5th Wednesday of the month. So we do not have a meeting, but we have lots of great programs scheduled for April. So let's bring back our Prince of Programs, Ken Grant, to tell us about them.
Okay, so yes, off next week, the week after that, all the rest of next month is at the Western, just by the way, but we're going to meet with Heather Snavely, who runs AAA. That'll be an interesting conversation. We met the head of AAA like 10 years ago, so it'll be good for an update. That's the week after next. The week after that, David Woodward brings together one of our favorites for the year, Diplomacy Day. That'll be awesome, but he's just putting the finishing touches to that. And then the week after that, we get to meet the state treasurer. So that'll be fun. And then do we have a slide for the week after that? Back to Zoom. Because that is our very own Tom Saros talking about the art of nonprofit giving. And I want to follow up on something that John Steckler talked about last week. Keep in mind corporate membership. It's very important. It's great for the club. It's a great way to keep us afloat and moving forward, and a great way to meet lots of different people as we grow back the club. All right, President Beth, back to you, everybody else. Have a great week.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate that shout out to corporate sponsorship. And I also want to just put a pin on the program with Heather Snavely from AAA of Washington. I have had the opportunity to meet Heather a few times, and she is an extraordinary new leader at that organization, especially coming out of the pandemic. So I think you'll really enjoy that program. So now, as we wrap up our meeting, your sports highlights, no surprise, are centered around a lot of basketball for March Madness. But first, we'll start with the World Baseball Classic Championship, where Japan beat Team USA 3-2. And our Kraken won in overtime at Dallas to remain in the top wild card spot with 12 games to play in the regular season. We are holding on tight to that playoff dream. Now, in the world of basketball, the University of Washington women's basketball team won their opening 2 rounds of the National Invitational, and now will host Kansas State on Friday at 7 o'clock in a 3rd round game. So we wish them the best of luck. The NCAA Women's Basketball Super Regional takes place at Climate Pledge Arena, and I'm actually coming to you from the arena right now because today is media day and tomorrow is practice day. Things are getting exciting around here. And we're going to be hosting the Sweet 16 and Elite 8 games. Those will take place this Friday through Sunday, and then the Elite 8 will be on Monday. So some highlights for you to make note of include Caitlin Clark of Iowa, who will be playing. She is a superstar player that everyone is talking about. And then there's the Louisville star, Haley Van Lith, who is a Washington native from Kashmir. And you may recall stories of Kobe Bryant actually visiting her in Kashmir at her high school, and he was a mentor to her. So she is also one to be cheering on as we have all of our teams here. Now, Friday, we'll see Colorado versus Iowa, and then Mississippi against Louisville. Both of those games are happening on Friday, and the winners will be meeting on Sunday to move on to the national semifinals. On Saturday, the number 1 seeded Virginia Tech plays Tennessee, and that perennial power UConn takes on Ohio State, with the winner playing on Monday, and then that winner also moving on to the Final Four. So I'll leave you with our quote for the day. Former Seattle Storm player Breanna Stewart said, "As a woman athlete, I see roughly the same number of guys coming up asking for autographs on my jersey as girls. Times are changing. I don't think my daughter has ever heard 'you play like a girl' because it's no longer relevant." Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.